Title: The previous owners left the Christmas tree up for 30 years. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. Most people expect the house to feel empty after the previous owners leave. Quiet. Still. Waiting for new life. But the house on Willow Creek Road never felt empty. For 30 years, the same Christmas tree stood in the living room window. Lights still glowing. Decorations untouched. No one ever took it down. No one ever replaced it. And the people who once lived there were never seen again. The house on Willow Creek Road had always been considered strange, but not for the reasons most abandoned houses were strange. It wasn't collapsing. The windows weren't broken. The lawn was not overgrown beyond recognition. In fact, the house looked almost maintained. From the outside, it appeared frozen in time, like a photograph from decades ago that someone had forgotten to update. The siding was faded but intact. The driveway remained clear. The porch light still worked, casting a weak yellow glow every evening whether anyone lived there or not. But what truly made people uneasy was the living room window. Behind the glass stood a full Christmas tree. Not a plastic one placed neatly in a box every January. A real tree, tall and slightly crooked, decorated with faded red ornaments and silver tinsel that had dulled into a gray color over time. And the lights still worked. Every night, the same dim multicolored lights blinked behind the dusty glass. The tree had been there for 30 years. Everyone in town knew the story, though most avoided talking about it directly. The house once belonged to the Harlan family, a quiet couple who moved into town during the winter of 1993. They kept mostly to themselves. No children. No visitors. Just the two of them living quietly at the edge of town. That December, neighbors noticed the Harlans had decorated early. The Christmas tree appeared in the living room window before the first snowfall. It glowed warmly against the cold darkness outside. It looked normal then, comforting even. But the Harlans were gone before Christmas ever arrived. No one ever saw them leave. There were no moving trucks. No packed boxes on the curb. No signs of departure. One day they were there. The next day they simply weren't. The police searched the house after concerned neighbors reported that the lights had been left on for days. They found no signs of violence. No signs of forced entry. No evidence that anything had gone wrong. Everything inside looked perfectly normal. Except for the Christmas tree. The tree lights were still plugged into the wall. And the needles on the branches had already begun to dry. Authorities assumed the Harlans had left suddenly for unknown reasons. The case faded into the background of local memory like many unexplained disappearances. But the house never changed. The electricity remained active even though no bills were ever paid. Snow was mysteriously cleared from the driveway every winter. The porch light continued to turn on every night at the exact same time. And the Christmas tree remained in the window. Year after year. Decade after decade. Eventually the town stopped trying to explain it. People simply avoided the house. Children were warned not to go near the property. Delivery drivers refused to stop there. Even real estate agents quietly removed the address from listings whenever someone asked about vacant homes nearby. Something about the place felt wrong. Not dangerous in an obvious way. Just wrong. Like something inside the house was still waiting. 30 years later, the property was finally sold. The buyer was a man named Adrian Keller, a freelance photographer who had recently moved to town looking for quiet places to work. The house had been listed at a price so low it seemed almost unreal. Most people would have asked questions. Adrian didn't. He had always been fascinated by abandoned places and forgotten history. The idea of living inside a house that time had seemingly ignored felt exciting rather than unsettling. When he first drove up the gravel driveway, the house looked exactly as it had in every photograph he had seen. Still, silent, waiting. The Christmas tree was visible through the dusty front window. Even during the middle of summer, the lights blinked faintly in the darkness of the living room. Adrian found it amusing. A strange quirk of the house. Something he could photograph later. The front door opened easily. No creaking. No resistance. Inside, the air smelled dry and stale, like paper left inside a closed drawer for too long. Dust covered most of the furniture, but not in thick layers. It looked more like a thin coating that had settled over the years rather than decades of neglect. The living room sat directly across from the entrance. And there it was. The tree. Standing exactly where it had always been. Adrian stepped closer, studying the decorations. The ornaments were clearly from another era. Glass bulbs with faded paint. Handmade paper stars. A few strands of silver tinsel hanging loosely from the branches. The tree itself had long since died. The needles were brittle and dark brown, clinging to the branches like dry skin. But the light still blinked. Slowly. Quietly. Red. Blue. Green. Red again. Adrian examined the power cord running from the tree to the wall outlet. It looked ancient. The plastic had yellowed with age and the wire felt stiff when he touched it. Yet somehow electricity was still flowing through it. He unplugged the cord. The lights went dark. The living room immediately felt colder. Adrian shrugged and continued exploring the house. The kitchen looked untouched since the early 90s. Old appliances. Dishes still neatly stacked in cabinets. A calendar on the wall frozen on December 1993. The bedrooms were similar. Closets still filled with clothes. Shoes left beside the bed. Books on nightstands. It felt less like a house that had been abandoned and more like a house someone had stepped out of briefly. As if the owners had planned to return. Adrian spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning and photographing the interior. By evening he had completely forgotten about the tree. He was in the kitchen when he noticed something strange. A faint glow flickering in the hallway. He walked back into the living room. The Christmas tree lights were on again. Blinking slowly. Red. Blue. Green. Adrian stared at the wall outlet. The cord was still unplugged. Yet the lights continued blinking as if nothing had changed. A strange unease settled in his chest, though he couldn't explain why. He unplugged the lights again just to be sure. But this time something else caught his attention. The ornaments on the tree had shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough that he noticed. One red ornament near the center of the tree was now hanging lower than before. Adrian frowned. He was certain it hadn't been like that earlier. He studied the branches more carefully. Something about the tree felt heavier. The branches seemed to sag slightly toward the floor, as if carrying more weight than decorations alone could explain. Adrian reached forward and gently moved aside a cluster of dried needles. What he saw behind them made the air leave his lungs. Hidden deep inside the tree was something that clearly did not belong there. Something pale. Something shaped like fingers. Thin. And wrapped tightly around one of the inner branches. Adrian stepped backward slowly. The lights blinked again. Red. Blue. Green. And for the first time since entering the house, Adrian realized something truly disturbing. The Christmas tree had not been decorated with ornaments alone. It had been decorated with something else. Something that had been hidden inside the branches for 30 years. And something that had never left the house. Adrian stood frozen in the living room, staring into the branches of the Christmas tree as the faint colored lights blinked against the dried needles. The pale shape inside the tree remained perfectly still, partially hidden beneath layers of brittle branches and faded decorations. At first his mind tried to reject what he was seeing. It looked like fingers. Thin and pale, curled tightly around a branch as if gripping it in desperation. The dried needles surrounding the shape made it difficult to see clearly, but the longer Adrian looked, the more certain he became. The shape was not part of the tree. It was something that had been placed there. Or something that had become trapped there. He forced himself to move closer again, leaning toward the tree while pushing aside several fragile branches. The needles cracked softly as they shifted. More of the shape became visible. A hand. Not bone. Not a decoration. A human hand, gray with age but still disturbingly intact, wrapped around the inner trunk of the tree as if someone had tried to hold onto it. Adrian staggered backward. The air inside the living room suddenly felt heavier than before, thick with a smell he hadn't noticed earlier. A faint odor of dry rot and something older, something that had been sealed away for far too long. His eyes slowly moved across the tree again. Once the hand had been noticed, other details began to emerge from the shadows of the branches. Another shape deeper inside. Then another. Hidden behind the ornaments and tinsel were fragments of something that had once been a human body. The decorations had not been hung on the tree. They had been hung around it. Around something that had been placed inside it. The realization crawled slowly through Adrian's mind like ice spreading across glass. The Harlans had not left the house. They had never gone anywhere. They had been inside the tree. For 30 years. The brittle branches shifted slightly as Adrian moved closer again, unable to stop himself from examining the horrifying discovery more carefully. The structure of the tree made it possible. The trunk was thick near the base, and the branches spread outward wide enough to conceal what was inside. Whoever had done it had carefully arranged the decorations afterward. Ornaments hung perfectly over the places where bone and fabric were hidden. Tinsel draped across shapes that should not have been part of a Christmas display. The body had become part of the tree itself. Dried. Preserved. Forgotten. Adrian felt his stomach twist as he noticed something else near the center of the branches. A second hand. this one smaller, wrapped tightly around another limb of the tree. The two sets of fingers faced each other across the trunk, frozen in a position that looked disturbingly deliberate, as if two people had reached for each other inside the tree and never managed to connect. The blinking lights continued their slow rhythm. Red, blue, green. Adrian stepped away from the tree again, breathing harder now as his mind tried to process the impossible scene in front of him. Two bodies, hidden inside the tree, decorated over, left standing in the living room window for decades. He looked toward the wall outlet again. The cord still hung unplugged, yet the lights kept blinking. Red, blue, green. The pattern was so steady that it almost felt intentional, like a heartbeat. A faint creaking sound moved through the room. Adrian turned toward the tree again. The branches had shifted, only slightly, but enough to send a ripple of movement through the ornaments. One of the glass bulbs slowly spun on its string, reflecting the colored lights across the walls. Adrian told himself the movement was nothing. The dried branches had probably been disturbed when he touched them earlier. But then another branch bent downward, this time more noticeably. A faint cracking sound followed. Adrian stepped backward again. The branches near the center of the tree seemed to sag further toward the floor, the decorations trembling slightly as the structure shifted. Something inside the tree was moving. Not falling. Not collapsing. Moving. The hand he had seen earlier slowly tightened around the branch. The fingers curled with slow, stiff effort, the brittle skin stretching slightly as the grip became stronger. Adrian felt the blood drain from his face. The second hand moved next. Its fingers flexed weakly, scraping against the dried bark of the trunk as though testing the strength of something that had not been used in a very long time. The blinking lights continued. Red, blue, green. The ornaments rattled softly as the branches shifted again. Adrian stumbled backward toward the hallway, unable to look away from the tree as the movements inside it grew more obvious. The shapes hidden among the branches were changing position. Bones that had once been still were now slowly adjusting within the narrow space of the tree. The branches bent outward as if something inside was pushing against them from within. The realization hit Adrian with crushing clarity. The bodies had not simply been hidden in the tree. They had been waiting there, waiting for someone to return, waiting for someone to unplug the lights, waiting for someone to disturb the branches. The living room suddenly felt impossibly small. Adrian turned toward the front door and hurried across the hallway, his steps quick and uneven as panic began to take hold. He reached for the door handle and pulled. The door did not move. He tried again. The handle turned easily, but the door remained firmly closed. A faint glow flickered behind him. Adrian turned slowly. The Christmas tree lights were brighter now. The blinking pattern had changed. Red, red, red. All the colors had disappeared except one. The branches spread outward as something inside them finally pushed free. The first figure emerged slowly from the tree, its body unfolding with stiff, unnatural movements after decades of confinement. Dried skin clung tightly to bone, and fragments of brittle needles remained tangled in what had once been clothing. The second shape followed soon after, pulling itself from the opposite side of the tree with equally slow determination. They moved toward each other first. The two skeletal figures reached out with shaking arms until their hands finally met across the empty space of the living room. For a moment they stood perfectly still. 30 years of silence held between them. Then their heads turned together toward Adrian. The blinking lights painted their hollow faces red. Adrian pressed himself against the door, desperately trying to force it open again, but the handle no longer turned. Behind him, the figures began to move forward. Their movements were slow but steady, each step leaving a trail of brittle needles falling to the floor. The Christmas tree behind them now stood empty. Bare branches stretched toward the ceiling where the bodies had once been hidden. The lights still blinked. Red. Adrian's breath came in shallow bursts as he realized something far worse than the bodies moving toward him. The tree had not been decorated for 30 years. It had been waiting for replacements. The front door finally opened. But the cold night air outside brought no relief. Because when Adrian looked back one final time, he saw the figures had already turned away from him. They were walking back toward the tree, their empty eye sockets fixed on the branches, studying them carefully, as if deciding exactly where the next bodies would fit. Some houses are abandoned because people leave. Others are abandoned because something inside refuses to let them. If you ever pass a house with a Christmas tree still glowing in the window long after the holidays are over, you might want to keep driving. And if the lights are blinking red, you might already be too late. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories that were never meant to be told.